Hello everyone. For the 50 people who end up watching this video, I welcome you. This is Erik, the Asian movie enthusiast, and we now continue with our exploration of Asian horror. So we've reached the 1970s, and already Japanese horror was experiencing some changes in trends. As we saw during our voyage through the 50s and 60s, many Japanese horror films were set during the samurai era. That trend began to fade a bit during the 1970s. Now, there were some samurai-era horror films that were made during the 1970s, some of which are very memorable, but they were beginning to ramp down a bit. Now, as I discussed previously, the issues of availability and production are going to create great differences in the number of Asian horror films that we will discuss during each time period. For the 1970s, we will look at 25 Asian horror films in a two-part video. Not a large number by any means, but I'm actually thankful that I found that many. This era is probably the most difficult time period for exploring Asian horror, with the 50s and 60s being the second most difficult era. Seeking out ways to legitimately find these films with English subtitles is a bit of an obstacle, but we already dealt with that while reviewing the 50s and 60s, right? So it's not that big of a deal. We can work around that. Just keep searching for some films that aren't available now. When they pop up, watch them, and there's still a good number that are highly available, you'll see. But it's arguably even more difficult to identify what Asian horror films were actually made during the 1970s. I had to research a number of different websites and slowly compile a watch list over time, which I was able to whittle down. But there was still a handful of Filipino and Indonesian films in particular that I never got to watch because I never found them anywhere. Now, if you know of any Asian horror films that are excluded from my reviews here and are also available for viewing, feel free to comment on this video and tell me about them because I would love to watch them. As things stand, however, I must conclude that there wasn't a whole lot going on in this industry during the 1970s. I don't think Asian horror had enough home runs during this time period to go toe-to-toe with American horror, or even Italian horror if you count giallo films. Now, I've personally found that one effective method, just for me, in terms of comparing different film industries, is to compile a list of favorite films from each of them, just the favorite films, and then analyze in terms of overall quality and quantity. I mean, since every industry makes bad films, I think this method works pretty well because it completely ignores the trash and considers only kind of the cream of the crop, or at least the movies that are good. Now, if one industry contributes a considerably greater number of your favorites, then that's probably the superior industry for you. So in my eyes, using that method, Asian horror was simply outmatched during the 1970s. However, it's still quite interesting to look at the horror films that were produced during this period, because a good number of them are worth watching, and a few are actually all-time classics, in my opinion. So let's begin. This video will cover 1970 to 1975. We will be limited mostly to Japan and the Philippines again, with a few films peppered in from other areas, such as Hong Kong. And remember, all the titles in the movies of the movies that I discuss are listed in the description box below. So the first film that we're covering tonight is called Vampire Doll from 1970, a Japanese horror film. Now, Vampire Doll is one that I kind of like, personally. This is the first film in the Toho Vampire trilogy, which also includes Evil of Dracula and Lake of Dracula. Now, all three films in this trilogy were directed by a man named Michio Yamamoto. Never heard of him? Well, that's because he only made a handful of movies. But it's nice to see that consistency at director for these three vampire films. Now, Vampire Doll in particularly, I think, is the most well-written of the series, but it also moves the slowest. The storyline plays out like a mystery that concerns the alleged death of a young woman who may or may not actually be dead. So this is more, it's more of an unorthodox take on the vampire mythos, at least when compared to subsequent films in this franchise. However, the mansion setting and effective scoring create a lot of mood and atmosphere. That's what I like the best about this. Now, the missing girl herself reappears at certain moments throughout the film, and she looks both beautiful and creepy with like these bright golden eyes. I kind of like the special effects on the eyes in this movie. So, if you're a fan of classical gothic style horror, you might like this one quite a bit. As I said, it's probably the best of the trilogy, and I consider it a very cool film. Now, Vampire Doll is available on DVD on eBay. You could find it on Amazon UK, iOffer, and even AsianCult.com, which is another kind of website that focuses on cult films. All three of these films in the Toho Vampire trilogy are available in a box set out there. Now, I don't think these films have been officially released in the United States, but you can find them in Region 1 or all-region format in the box sets. And I think it's called the box set is called the Bloodthirsty Trilogy. So, and that's available on numerous DVD websites. So you can actually get all three of these movies together for a reasonable price. So, you know, that's a consideration if you're into vampire flicks. But I will review the other two films a little bit later on here in this video. So let's move on here. The second film that we're covering tonight is called Beast of the Yellow Night from 1971. And this is a Filipino horror film. An awesome title, not so awesome movie, by our friend Eddie Romero, who directed the Blood Island trilogy. So in this film, Satan saves a man from death on condition that he becomes his disciple, which requires him to transform into a murderous beast at times. So, the interactions between the protagonist and Satan are rather interesting. I thought they were pretty good, with both actors turning in pretty good performances. So this film does have its merits, but unfortunately, these moments are few and far between, with the remainder of the story being very generic and dull. The dialogue overall is very shoddy and not very well written, you know, outside of the main interactions between the protagonist and Satan, of course. And there's not enough good stuff to hold interest throughout. The makeup effects are also fairly unimpressive, and the beast attacks are also fairly lame. So I would not recommend this one. Next is a film called Beast of Blood from 1971. Again, we stay in the Philippines. Now, this is the third film in the Blood Island trilogy by Eddie Romero. The previous entries, of course, that we covered before were Brides of Blood from 1968 and The Mad Doctor of Blood Island from 1969, both of which, as I said, were covered. Now, Beast of Blood is not as good as Brides of Blood, but it is better than The Mad Doctor of Blood Island. So after surviving a zombie monster attack on a ship, a man takes a team to investigate a nearby island, another island setting. You know, it's one of those unknown cliches of Asian horror back in the classic era, right? I mean, in our previous videos, we covered a handful of films on tropical islands or island environments. That's something you think about when you think of Asian horror, but they did explore this particular subgenre quite often. So this film, Beast of Blood, begins with a good opening scene depicting the zombie attack on the ship. Subsequent events take place on the tropical island, with mostly human-related dangers, conflicts between the humans. Now, the zombie does show up again, albeit in a somewhat incapacitated form, near the midpoint, as well as the mad scientist that's I guess you'd say, connected with him in a certain way. So this is a watchable flick. It could have used more zombie action, I think, and that might be the negative aspect that might turn people off and make them not enjoy this one. But I thought it was pretty good. Also, the actress Celeste Yarnall is just gorgeous, by the way. Just a little bit of an added bonus there for you. So, we've talked about this before, but it's one of those older Asian films that doesn't give you quite enough of what you want going into it, but I would cautiously recommend it. Now, Beast of Blood has a wide availability on DVD, so if you're interested, check it out. Not a high priority, though. Alright, so what's next here? We have Lake of Dracula, 1971. We're back to Japan. Now, this is the second film, as I mentioned, in the Toho Vampire trilogy, and is likely the most horror-packed of the bunch, despite receiving mostly negative reviews on the internet. Now, one thing to understand is that you can watch these films in this trilogy in any order, because they are all self-contained storylines, much like the Blood Island trilogy. Now, in this one, a woman who is haunted by a nightmare from her childhood discovers that she has been targeted by a vampire. The script is on the weak side, which probably explains the negative reception it has received, and the performances are mediocre, but there are some beautifully composed shots here, lots of spooky atmosphere, and an old-school gothic style that make this watchable. Now, many reviewers, despite criticizing the film, have pointed out that this trilogy is heavily influenced by Hammer horror films. So if you have a soft spot for that kind of thing, feel free to check it out. This one in particular. Even though it's probably the weakest overall in the trilogy, but I still enjoy it. And again, I've covered the DVD availability of these films previously. You could get it in a number of spots. The next film, now we go back to the Philippines, The Twilight People from 1972. In this film, a kidnapped diver is taken to an island, of course, inhabited by a mad scientist, of course, and his half-animal, half-human creations in this film by Eddie Romero, of course. So this is yet another humanoid monster film that's set on an island. A genre trend that you wouldn't necessarily expect. But this one, unfortunately, is not very good. The hybrids are kind of lame. Terrible makeup effects in this movie, man. I mean, some of the previous movies that I've recommended, had their B-movie qualities. But, I mean, this one has terrible makeup effects, so I just gotta point it out. The big problem here is that it's more boring than you might expect from a film like this. Very low-quality B-movie type stuff we're talking about here. It doesn't have the unintentional hilarity, maybe, that some of the other humanoid monster films that we covered have, that make those watchable. Although I must say that in this film there's a Batman, I call him the Bat Dude, who's quite funny. I still say, if you want a good movie regarding this premise, go watch The Horrors of Malformed Men from 1969 instead. It's significantly better than this. Alright, so our next film. We stay in the Philippines again. Philippines is kind of dominating this video, isn't it? This film is called Dracula Goes to the RP, and that's a film from 1973. This is very obscure, and as I say sometimes, it's obscure for a reason, folks. So, a man receives the dead body of his half-brother, who promptly returns to life as a vampire. So this was viewed without subtitles. So some of the spoken jokes escape me, because this is kind of a horror-comedy hybrid. There are a lot of visual gags to assess, however, and they weren't particularly funny. I did enjoy the cheesy transformation scene from vampire to bat, and the finale does have a little bit of atmosphere to it, so that was kind of enjoyable. But I felt the pacing really dragged here. But again, without subtitles, it's kind of hard to assess a film like this, that there was kind of a lot of dialogue. So it's just another reason to not seek it out, because I don't think you're going to find it with subtitles to properly assess some of the spoken jokes, you know what I mean? Now, as a side note, I do believe that the letters RP in the title refer to the Republic of the Philippines, by the way, in case you were wondering. Because when I first saw the title, I'm like, what does RP mean? Did a little research, that's what it means. So, you can skip that one. If you feel like a vampire film, check out that Toho Vampire trilogy instead. Next film, we stay in the Philippines again with a film called Florinda from 1973. When her fiancé disappears, a woman discovers the dark secrets of her home. I'll leave it at that. Kind of a mystery. This is nicely shot with an atmospheric mansion location. It has a melodramatic, romanticized tone throughout, especially at the start, which I felt kind of dragged a bit, but it sets the tone. It's a little bit different. It's almost like a horror drama, almost slight romance, you know what I mean, given the tone. Now, darker elements do begin to ramp up near the 40-minute mark and build throughout the latter half. So, the story was a little bit predictable, I thought, even without subtitles. But I did find this to be entertaining enough for a watch and generally well acted. Now, I have read online that this is considered a classic horror film in its home country, so just keep that in mind. Again, the lack of subtitles here could deter some because there's quite a bit of dialogue. You just got to be used to watching films like that and just kind of slugging through it. So, very cautious recommendation here. Florinda, not available on DVD, but it is streaming on YouTube without subtitles, which is where I watched it. So let us continue here. Alright, we're going back to Japan. Evil of Dracula, 1974. So a teacher takes a position at a remote girls' school, which just so happens to be terrorized by vampires. Again, this is the third film in the Toho Vampire trilogy, along with Vampire Doll and Lake of Dracula. And this one, I think, does a pretty good job of blending a good story with enough horror sequences, the best of which occur during the final half hour. Now, the positives here are the environments in and around the principal's mansion, the storyline, which is pretty interesting, and a few cool horror sequences. Now, much of the film is spent on the teacher's investigation of the principal, but there is also a very interesting origin story of how vampires came to be in Japan, which is pretty cool. There's lots of vampire activity going on, and the acting's pretty good, and there are quite a few cute ladies for the guys out there. So, this trilogy started with a deliberately paced but impressive film, Vampire Doll, then shifted to a horror-packed but shoddily scripted Lake of Dracula, then ended with a more balanced film, Evil of Dracula. So I like all three of these movies, and you actually get a slightly different experience with each of them. They're consistent, kind of an overall tone and theme, but they're all just, I can remember, specific scenes from each of them. They're easily distinguishable from one another. I kind of like that. I still say, if you're doing, if you're watching a bunch of horror movies in October and you want a triple header of old school vampire shenanigans, check all three of these out. Get the box set and just have a ball one night. Break out some of your Japanese whiskey and just go nuts. Again, I cover the DVD availability. There, you could find them. Next, let's move on. We have Ghost Eyes from 1974, and this film is from Hong Kong. Alright, so in Ghost Eyes, an evil optometrist uses supernatural contact lenses to control a woman's mind, using her for sex and draining her life force. Dear. Now, one intended consequence of this is that the woman experiences side effects, like seeing ghosts. So the concept here is somewhat similar to the Hong Kong horror film The Eye from 2002, but it's also quite different given the brief synopsis I just gave. Overall, the overall execution just is not very good here. There's no memorable sequences or moments. Even off the top of my head, I can't really remember anything that happened here. There are a few good, shots here and there. The sound design is just way off in this. It's really bad. It's not often where you get, a mediocre horror film that just has terrible sound design, but this is one of them. I mean, really poorly timed placement of unnecessarily loud music. It just completely took me out of the film in this. Like I said, there's a decent visual atmosphere at times, but it doesn't save this. The director here, Chi Hung Kwei, also directed The Killer Snakes, which is from 1974, which is much better. and we'll get to that one very soon. Ghost Eyes, I say you could skip it. Next, we return to the Philippines again. Kill Barbara with Panic, also known as, let me try this, Patayin Mo Sa Sindak Si Barbara. Not bad. 1974. After her emotionally unstable sister's mysterious suicide, a woman returns home but realizes that her sister haunts from the grave. Now the setup here is that Barbara's sister had previously fallen in love with the same man as Barbara and threatened to kill herself if Barbara didn't give him up to her. So Barbara reluctantly agrees, allowing her sister to marry this guy. Now the odd thing is that this man was aware of this entire situation and agrees to marry this woman who he doesn't love out of consideration for Barbara and I guess her sister's well-being. Kind of an odd setup, right? So subsequent to the wedding, Barbara moves away to give the lovebirds some time to, to really fall in love genuinely. But at a later time, I guess, her sister's suicide occurs and Barbara returns home and sees what's going on. Now this film felt like it had a pretty low budget that can be felt at times, but overall I'd say this is pretty good. The horror elements are a mix of ghostly hauntings, human possession, and creepy dolls. That's a positive. I would have to say the doll and the finale are two highlights that are quite memorable. And again, after doing a little research, it looks like this film is considered a classic in its home country. But I actually prefer the 1995 remake, which we'll get to in a later video. I viewed this one without subtitles. You may have to do so as well. But if you're interested in classic Filipino horror, I think this is a good one to check out. I mean, I think it really is considered a classic in its home country. Difficult to find, but it does pop up on YouTube occasionally. Again, without subtitles. So next. Oh no. Oh man. Wakamatsu, man, what are you doing to me? You go back to Japan for one of Koji Wakamatsu's worst films. It's called 100 Years of Torture, The History, from 1975. This is an exploitation horror drama by our boy Wakamatsu, who directed Violated Angels from 1967 and Vengeance Demon from 1968. I generally like this guy's movies. This one is horrible. So this film is only 63 minutes long, but it is packed with rape and torture. Okay? But like some Japanese exploitation films, both in the past and in the modern day, it's just too monotonous for its own good. The big problem is that the violence in this particular movie is not creative, and it just becomes tedious to watch. I mean, when you make like rape and torture just tedious and boring, you're not hitting the right buttons on the viewer. The big surprise though here is that the production values are atrocious. It looks cheap, and it's just really grating on the eyes and ears, man. But that's not all. I mean, even the direction in this is bad. And that's something I almost never say about Wakamatsu, man. I don't know if this was just a paycheck for him or what. But I was surprised that this director made something so unwatchable. So, obviously, I do not recommend this turd. It's a turd. Skip it. Next, we come to The Killer Snakes. Alright? So, The Killer Snakes here is a Chinese horror film from 1975. I believe it is a Hong Kong horror film. I don't think this one was made on the mainland. And as I said before, it was directed by Chi Hong Kwei, the man who brought us Ghost Eyes from 1974. Now, most fortunately, this is better than that film. So, a bullied, sexually repressed guy befriends some poisonous snakes. Okay. And then promptly orders them to murder his enemies. Alright. Good premise. Quite a different premise, and it's a welcome one. Now, fair warning. I'm telling you right off the bat, this does get pretty sleazy at times, and it does have quite a bit of sexual content, even bondage. But I found it to be very interesting to watch, given the protagonist's mental state. There's also some cool snake-inflicted deaths, which can only help matters, right? Probably a bit too sleazy for the average viewer, but the conflicts are strong, and there are a few surprises as well. I think this movie, it's a movie that I think has some balls, as I like to say. You know, it's got a bit of an edge to it, and it's an interesting film, a little bit different from what you would typically see. So, DVD availability on Killer Snakes is widely available. So if you're interested in that type of thing, feel free to check that one out. You can easily find it. Now, again, we make a transition from sleazy to classy, as we've done in a few previous videos. And this will be the last film that we cover in this particular installment. And it is also the best film that we will cover in this video, in my opinion. Now, I consider this to be a horror classic and a must-see for everyone. It's close, man. It could be my favorite Asian horror film from this particular decade, the 1970s. And that film is called Under the Blossoming Cherry Trees. Let me say that again. Under the Blossoming Cherry Trees. There you go. 1975, and it's from Japan. So this film was directed by Masahiro Shinoda, who is yet another Japanese director who should be more well known in the West. He's made a number of good films. In fact, he made a film called Silence in 1971, which is based on the same source material as Martin Scorsese's upcoming film of the same name. And I must say that Scorsese has some work to do if he wants to make a film as impactful as Shinoda's. That was a good film. But what about Under the Blossoming Cherry Trees? Well, in the forests of Japan, a beautiful woman bends a murderous mountain man to her will. So at first she uses him to kill indiscriminately, but after a while the villainess shows a macabre, perverted hobby that needs to be seen to be believed. This is good stuff. There's a theme of womanly power over man that's omnipresent in this. And the relationship between the two leads is very captivating. As the title suggests, there are also some very nice environments like forests, cherry blossoms, etc., and some gorgeous cinematography. This one was really well shot, man. The cherry trees themselves almost mirror the concept of madness and are presented almost like a force of nature, which is also really cool. There is some nudity and some decapitated heads, which yield some truly memorable sequences. But this is a high-quality artistic horror film that has an edge to it. You know, this is a must-see, man. You gotta watch this movie. Now, what about its availability, though? Am I telling you to go watch something that you can't, it's impossible to find? No, I would never do that, right? It's available on Hulu right now. So after you're done with this video, after you subscribe to my channel and click like on this video like you do with all of my videos, go to Hulu and watch Under the Blossoming Cherry Trees. You will not regret it. It is really good stuff. So that's it for this particular installment of our Asian Horror Year in Review playlist. So the big priority here, I told you, Under the Blossoming Cherry Trees. Followed by maybe the Bloodthirsty trilogy. Nice little vampire trilogy there to look at. And then if you're more into the kind of shady type stuff, check out Killer Snakes. And make sure you stay tuned for my next video in this series, as we will cover the rest of the 1970s. And as always, we'll see you next time.